I am really pleased to have Darlene Lancer here. And welcome, Darlene.
Thank you very much for having me. I think this is a great idea to have a summit on abuse.
Yeah, and you have fabulous information. We're going to talk today about dealing with an abuser, which is probably why most people are listening right now. But we're going to talk about crucial information in dealing with an abuser and confronting abuse. Most victims respond to abuse in ways that sometimes make it worse, and they overlook the single most important thing that undermines their ability to stop that abuse and prevent it from damaging their self-esteem. So we're going to talk about valuable tips and strategies and resources. I'm really, really excited about this. So Darlene, tell us a little bit about what you're doing right now and what your practice is all about.
Well, I see people individually, I see couples, and I coach people internationally. And I wrote Codependency for Dummies years ago, and I thought I'd be getting a lot of people who just had issues with codependency. And it was interesting that a lot of clients came to me because they were in relationships with narcissists.
Mm-hmm.
And so that expanded my practice, and I wrote a book about dealing with a narcissist. And underneath all of that codependency and allowing abuse and the effects of abuse is shame.
Yes.
Abuse is very shaming and damaging to our self-esteem.
Right.
And most people aren't even aware of it. So that led to a second book on conquering shame.
And those are really important concepts, because often when you're in abuse, you can't see it and you're not sure what it's all about or why you're feeling bad about this relationship, but you sometimes you can't just pinpoint it. Sometimes you can, but sometimes you can't. But there are all different
I was in an
kinds.
abusive relationship, yeah, and
Yeah.
I didn't even know it.
So we will talk about different types of abuse, such as gaslighting, triangulation, that sort of thing. But I know there's lots of different forms of abuse. Can you kind of give us an overview of some of the more common and then less common forms of abuse?
Well, people are usually pretty easy to spot violence.
Right.
Physical abuse.
Yeah.
But a lot of people, if it's not physical abuse, they don't even recognize it. In fact, breaking your property, breaking your phone, things like that.
Right.
That's considered physical abuse, even though it's not to your person. But abuse can take many forms, including some things that are maybe you wouldn't spot, such as withholding, attention, companionship, money, resources, affection, and manipulation. If you grew up in a family that one of your parents was manipulative, you won't recognize manipulation for what it is. It just feels familiar.
Right.
So I did a blog on manipulation, but also controlling behavior. If someone you're with dictates who you see, where you go, things like that.
And that kind of includes like jealousy, like over abundant jealousy, jealousy to the point that they control you.
Right.
Yeah.
Who were you with? What did you say?
Yeah.
And they start intimidating you and interrogating you.
Right.
Your friendships and your conversations.
Yeah.
And then, of course, more overt types of verbal abuse would be blaming, belittling you, criticizing you, judging, name-calling, ordering you around, things like that, raging, especially narcissistic rage. That's just, the whole point is intimidation.
And there are some people who won't physically hit you, but will act like they're hitting you or hit the wall next to you.
Threatening,
yes. Yeah.
Threatening behavior is intimidation, and that's abusive.
Yeah.
In fact, living under a threat of violence can be like terrorism. So you don't actually ever have to experience it. Just threats of it, either with a show of force or with words. You better watch out or you'll be sorry, things like that. Threatening words.
Mm.
So those are more overt. And then there's teasing, malicious jokes, sarcasm.
Right.
That can be abusive too. And more subtle might be blocking you, just undermining you. So you try to have a conversation and they're always opposing you.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't, they challenge whatever you say.
Yeah.
They're opposing you or blocking your conversation as a way of saying, shut up.
Right. Yeah.
Or they just keep switching topics. It's the same thing. You try to bring up something, they Rolodex all the things you do. They shift the blame to you.
Mm-hmm.
And most victims will just become defensive.
Right.
And let the abuser control the conversation.
Yeah.
The abuser is going to want to take the light off of their behavior and shift it to you.
Mm-hmm.
And if you let that happen, they win. So I mentioned belittling, any kind of discounting, like or sabotaging your efforts. You're never going to be good at that. You know, that's foolish. That endeavor, that project, that job you want to take, or anything that minimizes or trivializes your feelings.
Mm-hmm.
You're too sensitive.
Right.
You're always getting emotional.
Mm.
Why are you so emotional? Things like that. When you're feeling hurt. And then interrupting and undermining. So things that, like, you don't know what you're talking about, or who do you think you are?
Right.
Finishing your sentences.
And they'll often provoke you, like for they will say things to get you to respond in anger or get you to say something, and then they'll immediately discount you for
That's
that.
right. Yeah. They will want. There's it's not exactly what you're saying, but there's a game in those. Years ago, Eric Berne wrote, games people play. And there's one called Yes, But Kick Me. So this is someone who wants to provoke an argument.
Mm-hmm.
So then they can feel like the victim.
Right. Right.
So they might ask you for advice, for example, and they have a yes, but. And then sooner or later, they shift from being a victim to now you're the victim.
Mm-hmm.
And they start attacking you.
Mm-hmm.
So this is different forms of that, provoking you, and then you're attacking them.
Wow.
With passive-aggressive people, that's abuse too.
Mm-hmm.
And then they call it like a wolf in sheep's clothing, so you wouldn't know it.
Right.
But you have to listen to your gut. If something feels wrong, even though the words are nice, it's hidden, it's covert hostility is what it is.
Yes.
So
And a good relationship would not have those type of manipulative tactics.
Right. So it's important to learn not only for the abuser doesn't know how to be assertive. A passive-aggressive person, they're aggressive or they're passive. And often victims are passive and they don't know how to be assertive. So one of the first ebooks I wrote was how to speak your mind, become assertive and set limits.
Right.
And then I did a webinar on how to be assertive, to be able to stand up to an abuser. I actually took a class in assertiveness decades ago. And I started speaking, I actually didn't recognize abuse for what it was.
Wow.
I know it didn't feel good, but I didn't know to attribute the word abuse to it, that's what it was. And then I started calling it out, and it really improved our relationship.
Yeah. I think a lot of people are afraid to say the A word, abuse. They say, oh, it's just a tough relationship, or, oh, he's just stressed, or, oh, he's, just having a bad day. But if you find yourself making excuses for the other person's behavior, something's wrong.
Yeah, I think it's because the victim feels humiliated.
Right.
So unfortunately, somebody who's abusing you, whether it's physical or emotional, they're coming from a place of shame, just like a bully. And by having power over you, they feel more important. And they lift up their low self-esteem. But what happens is then the victim carries the shame. It's an
Right.
unconscious process. And you shouldn't feel, no one should feel ashamed for someone else's behavior.
Yeah.
So the victim, even though we might feel humiliated and embarrassed, that's one of the problems is people don't talk about abuse and they don't talk about violence because they feel humiliated.
Right.
But they're not the one that did anything wrong.
Yeah.
It's the perpetrator that is. And that's a big obstacle
Yeah.
to getting help.
Exactly.
You mentioned something I'd like to address, and that's denial.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, we're talking about that. And if you give me a minute, I want to read you some questions
Sure.
people can ask themselves. It's in my book. I just thought of it.
Codependency for Dummies. Yay.
And there's a whole chapter on denial. And there's some questions you ask yourself. And sometimes I read it to clients and they say yes to all of them. So one is, do you spend time thinking about how you'd like things to be? I remember in this relationship, I thought, if only, I had the if onlys.
Mm-hmm.
And do you say to yourself, here we go, if only he or she would, be act differently. So do you make excuses for someone to other people?
Yeah.
Or to yourself? Well, he's just under stress. Or, or she's under stress, too many kids, or something like that to take care of. Do you minimize or rationalize bad behavior? So rationalize it. These are forms of denial. Minimize it. Well,
Mm-hmm.
he doesn't mean it. Or he just pushed me. He didn't really, I don't have any bruises or anything like that.
Right.
Or minimize your feelings. Well, I can take it. It really didn't affect me. It's just words.
Yeah.
But what happens is we numb ourselves and start to shut down, and that's not healthy either. So those are minimization, rationalization. Those are ways, forms of denial.
I think that's what a lot of people don't stop and look inward and look and really take a sharp look at what is happening. They're just kind of skimming over the surface and they're not even asking themselves these questions, or they're not really taking a look at the behavior. They're trying to get past it. They're just trying to minimize it to get past it. So let's move on to the, a better, part of this relationship. Let's skip
or
that.
even worse, they're walking on eggshells not to upset
Right.
user.
Right.
So then they have to shut down part of their personality.
Mm-hmm.
They stop expressing themselves.
Yeah.
They start storing up resentments, and they start pulling away. So some other questions are, do you believe broken promises? It'll never happen again. Don't feel guilty. I feel worse than you. I mean, if somebody even admits feeling guilty, an abuser, or assure that it won't happen again.
Yeah.
With violence, you can be sure it's going to happen again.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty much so. In fact, people who have been physically abused, on average, there's 7 incidents before they leave. So don't shame yourself or feel bad that you're taking it, and the other reason that people go into denial is because it's a protective mechanism, because they might think, if I confront it, I might have to leave.
Right. And they're afraid of that unknown. Mm-hmm.
So it's better to not think about it, like an affair or something. I'm going to tell myself, rationalize it or excuse it, so I don't have to respond.
Right.
And people may not know how to respond. So that's why this webinar is really important.
Yeah.
But you need outside support when you're dealing with an abuser. Do you think the relationship or behavior will improve when something happens, like when he gets a job, when she gets pregnant, or when we move, things like that? Here's a big one. Do you continue to make concessions or change yourself,
right,
hoping that the relationship or the person's behavior will improve? So maybe if I'm just more loving, or maybe if I give him or her more sex, or whatever it might be. Make more money. You know, if I keep accommodating, which is one of the wrong ways to deal with abuse.
Right.
And lastly, I think you mentioned this, is do you cover up or not reveal to family and friends what's going on, or aspect of your relationship that embarrasses you?
Right.
So that's a red flag. If you're feeling you have to hide something, you're feeling ashamed, and there's no reason you feel it should be ashamed of what's going on.
Yeah, because if, we should never be ashamed of our relationships, right? And if you're hiding parts of your relationship from friends and family, there's something wrong with that.
And you should never be ashamed for someone else's behavior.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
You know.
So now we know some of those forms of abuse, and we're going to call them abuse. We're just going to call them, those are abuse. You might not have recognized them until now. So what is the profile of an abuser? And if we're out in the world and let's say we're dating again after being in one of these relationships, how do you spot one so you don't get it back into that situation again?
Usually you can tell pretty early on, but it can be obfuscated by someone who's very seductive. That could be a red flag. Or showering you with compliments or expensive restaurants, things like that. So one thing you want to look out for is control. So someone who won't compromise in terms of where you go, when you meet, wanting you to meet their schedule, drive to their area of where they live, things like. I'm talking about a man, for a woman, or it could be a woman who has to go to this restaurant, the most expensive restaurant or something.
Right.
But the profile of someone is that they're basically insecure. But you may not see that because they might act very overly confident and savoir-faire, and you won't know that right away. But in terms of dating, how they treat other people, how they treat the waitress, the waiter, do they object to standing in line? Do they have the sense of entitlement? Are they rude to other people? Are they bad-mouthing their ex?
Right.
It's because then sooner or later they may do that to you. Someone who's distrustful. An abuser is basically distrustful underneath. And someone who's needy. So they have to have things their way. That's another way of being needy, not just help me. But if you are trying to rescue someone, that's not a good idea either.
Exactly.
The tables will change because they're going to want to control.
And a lot of times they tell a sad story of poor childhood. Poor me, my boss fired me because it wasn't ever my fault. It's never their fault.
Right, never taking responsibility, actually, yeah.
Yeah. So that's, and then they rush things, right? They do that love bombing where, they are just the best boyfriend, in the entire world, and they're going way over the top, and you think you found, the love of your life finally, and it's way over the top.
Yeah, if they don't have a circle of friends, but they might, you can't always tell by that. If they're blaming other people, they're acting like the victim.
Right.
You don't want to have love at first plight. You see someone who's really had a rough life and think that all these other women that were, the cause of their problems, that it's somehow going to be different with you.
Right.
That you're going to be the one now that's going to meet their needs and change things. So those are just some. And someone, like you said, rushes so they don't observe your boundaries. They want to move too quickly. Or they ask you invasive questions about your finances or or bring up sex too quickly,
Right.
or inappropriate conversations, things like that.
Yeah. And so it's never a good reason to rush things just because this person says they're so in love with you and you're the one that, you know, they want to spend the rest of your life with. Still, you need to go at a reasonable pace and do your due diligence in checking this person out.
Yeah.
And if they really are, then they will wait for you and they will, you know, continue on. But narcissists and sociopaths can't do that for that long, right? They will
Well,
get
you might,
impatient.
and might, if someone is lying to you, you won't know that right away.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to take some time
Yeah.
till you catch them in some lies. But, you know, I think maybe nowadays women, if they want an exclusive relationship, they may not be upfront about saying that because maybe they think it's too pushy or that'll scare the man off or something.
Right.
But if that's what you want, you should speak up about it and ask for an exclusive, when you're ready to have sex,
Right.
you know, ask for an exclusive relationship and, you know, make sure that you get tested, both of you, for STDs.
Yeah.
And if somebody tries to brush you off or be dismissive about that,
Mm-hmm.
that's showing that they're not sensitive to your health and your concerns.
Right.
And so I know a lot of women just back off.
And you're kind of lowering your standards, right? When you start to lower your standards or move, like you said, your boundaries a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
that's a warning sign.
Yeah. And it's natural when you're first dating someone that you want to, you might want to make the relationship work. So you naturally want to please them. But if you start feeling uncomfortable inside, you know, people who have been abused in childhood, like I said, you might not recognize manipulation. Well, if you've been verbally abused, you might not recognize it too. If you've
Mm-hmm.
been controlled, so, or molested. So many times people confuse excitement with fear.
Mm.
So they're feeling this intensity and excitement about the date, but you have to ask yourself, am I anxious? Do I really feel comfortable with this person?
Right.
Because some of that is not just excitement, it's anxiety. And if you're
That's
anxious with
interesting.
someone, it's maybe replaying something from your past,
Mm.
and it's exciting, but that's a warning sign.
Yeah.
So really, you have to stay connected to your body.
Yeah, exactly.
And be clear about your physical boundaries and your emotional boundaries. So people will generally treat you the way you expect to be treated. So, and if they don't, you know, you haven't lost any. I mean, if they don't respect your boundaries and you say, you know, goodbye, you've gained, not lost.
Right.
Because
Exactly.
you've avoided future pain.
Probably saved, yes, a lot of heartache for
Yeah.
yourself. So let's talk about some counterproductive ways to react to abuse. So we know we've talked about some of those forms of abuse. How do we sometimes react that's not in a healthy way?
Well, I mentioned a few things, and it's natural, I think, or maybe not, maybe it would just be natural to me or a lot of women, but to try to appease someone.
Yes.
So if they're being, and then you want to like calm them down. So if someone's angry, it's like you want to calm them down, you just want to keep the peace. Maybe that's how you handled it in your family,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe that's how you witness one parent deal with an aggressive parent, to just try to keep the peace and be appeasing. And an abuser will see that as weakness.
Mm.
Just like a ferocious animal. They see your fear and weakness, then they're going to attack.
Right.
So it invites more control and abuse on their part.
Wow.
And then similarly, pleading is a sign of weakness. So particularly with narcissists, they have such disdain for weakness because they can't stand it in themselves. They want to be in, you know, the one in power, have power over you. So they don't want to show any vulnerability, and they can't stand anyone else showing vulnerability
Right.
and weakness.
So when you're like you're in initially in a relationship and you start to feel that, hey, you're down here and they're up here, or there is a misbalance of power, would that be another warning sign if you start
Yeah.
to, I don't know, what, just subvert yourself, you know what I mean,
Right, if
to
you keep accommodating,
accommodate? Yes, exactly.
that's showing that they have to have control.
Right.
What I said, like in the early stage of dating, if they can only meet you at a certain time or a certain schedule, and you have to keep accommodating their schedule.
If you're the one accommodating most of the time, that's
Yeah. I mean, there's give and take, obviously,
right.
but hopefully you can compromise.
Mm-hmm.
And it has to be a two-way street,
Mm-hmm.
right, for it to work. That's a sign how it's going to be. It's going to be even worse later on. I mean, if someone isn't willing to go out of their way when they're first trying to impress you and
Right.
dating, think how it would be in a couple years.
Exactly.
They take you're setting the pattern for the relationship in the beginning. So
set the right pattern, and if they are resistant to it, then that's not the person you need to be with.
yeah.
Right.
So then another way to deal with abuse is just to withdraw. That's another common thing. I'm just going to avoid and withdraw
Mm-hmm.
and not say anything. That might be a good temporary tactic, but particularly if it's part of setting a boundary.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't stop, I'm going to withdraw. But just to withdraw doesn't deal with the abuse. It's just like a Band-Aid.
The issue is still there.
And it'll reoccur and reoccur.
Yeah.
And then the worst thing is like arguing and fighting back.
You will never, ever, ever win.
Yeah, and it just escalates.
Yes.
And you're not setting a boundary. And when you start to get put on the defensive and you start defending yourself, that sends the message that the abuser has the right to approve me or disapprove me. That the abuser has control over my self-esteem. That I have to answer to you and explain myself and defend myself. And a lot of times, the abuser will railroad you into another conversation. You want to talk about one thing, and they may bring up the past or start attacking you about something else, and then you're defending yourself, and now he or she's in control of the conversation.
Exactly. And you don't know where this is going to come from. I mean, they do it to throw you off your game, and then you get confused, and then you're just again in a position of weakness and being controlled.
Yeah, the other thing about arguing and fighting, well, for one thing, it gives more ammunition to the abuser. The more you say, it's like you're giving them evidence to throw in your face.
Right.
But more importantly, and this is really key, you have to understand that the abuser is only interested in power. When they're in an abusive state, like, it's about having power over you. It's not about what you're discussing.
Right.
For you to start talking about the facts or, what really, trying to convince someone of what really happened or whatever, you're missing the whole point.
It's futile.
Huh?
It's futile.
Well, it's not only futile, it's counterproductive, because you have to address the medium, not the message.
Right.
Years ago, there was this famous book by Marshall McLuhan, The Medium is the Message. So you have to address how they're talking to you, not what they're saying.
Mm-hmm.
So please don't raise your voice to me, or please don't order me. Or if you continue to negate what I'm saying or order me, I'm not going to continue this conversation. You address the manner that they're speaking.
Right.
Not the content.
Uh-huh.
So I mentioned explaining and defending, and then trying to get the abuser to understand you. So,
Totally useless.
so a lot of people have a wound from their childhood where they never felt understood.
Right.
And they may be in a relationship with someone who's like one of their parents, who isn't interested in understanding them, who is not empathic, and they keep playing this pattern over to try to fix what was, trauma in their childhood, in their marriage, in their relationship. So that's something to deal with in therapy. You're not going to get understanding from an abuser because, again, the abuser is interested in power.
Yeah.
Not understanding. And when you're talking about a narcissist, they could care less about your feelings. It's all about their needs and what they feel.
Right.
You're just, an extension, an object to them. So they're definitely not interested.
Yeah.
And then criticizing and complaining because the abuser, as I said, is insecure. So even though they might act arrogant and a know-it-all and controlling, inside they have a lot of shame. And they're very sensitive. They can dish, but they can't take. So they're very sensitive to criticism. So that's why being assertive is important. So when you bring up things, you don't want to tell them that they're so inconsiderate, they're so selfish. For sure, you don't want to call your partner a name and say you're a narcissist. I mean, that's really inflammatory and provocative. So there's special ways to bring up things and talk about it. You could say, when you raise your voice at me, you could repeat their words and say, when you call me a bitch, when you slam the door, things like that. So you're describing behavior rather than attributing a pejorative adjective to that. So that way you're not calling them names and they don't feel as criticized.
All right. So we've talked about some counterproductive ways to react to abuse. What is the most important weapon against abuse?
Well, to having good self-esteem. And one of the ways that an abuser undermines your self-esteem, well, the abuse is, but one of the effects of that is that victims take things personally. They take the words of the abuser to heart. And then they start thinking, it's my fault, something's wrong with me. They'll put you down and say you're not entitled to, who do you think you are? You have no class, they'll just keep putting you down. And if you take that to heart, then it's like cutting you off at your legs. And you don't feel like you have a right to stand up to yourself. You start questioning. You start doubting your perceptions. Did this really happen? Maybe I don't remember right, or maybe I'm just not a good enough wife or partner. I didn't say things the right way. If I only had the right word.
It goes back to those if onlys, right? If only I did this, then it would be, we would have a better relationship. If only.
Yeah. Well, it can work both ways. I was thinking if only he or she, would just, but it could see if only I were different.
Yeah.
So you're never responsible for someone else's behavior, and they're shaming you because they have shame. You need to build, learning to be assertive builds self-esteem. And how you speak reflects self-esteem. I also wrote an ebook, 10 Steps to Self-Esteem, and a webinar on that because that's one of your defenses.
Yeah.
People
I think
only treat you.
So many women do not have good self-esteem, and they don't recognize it, that they don't.
And studies show it starts in childhood. There's evidence of that around 9 years old in young girls. That's a whole other conversation.
Yeah.
But self-blame is one of the counterproductive things, blaming yourself. And one other thing I didn't mention is threatening. So you don't want to make up empty threats. If you do that again, I'll leave, until you really mean it.
Right.
So otherwise, you become like the boy that cried wolf. And if you don't carry out a consequence, you invite more abuse.
Right.
So take baby steps when you're setting boundaries. Make sure you can live with them.
Well, that's great information. So the most important weapon against abuse is self-esteem. So that's a really good lesson for all of us to boost our self-esteem and work on that no matter what stage you're in. But what is the best plan to confront abuse? Or is it a good idea to confront abuse?
Well, there are different ways to do it. Sometimes you can just use humor, or you can be direct about it. But being assertive is really important to be assertive.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to know that what you want, what's your bottom line, and what are you willing to tolerate or not tolerate. And then and I suggest writing out scripts. I have some in my books and my webinar, so that you're prepared, practice it. And so you could say it calmly, not to do it in anger.
Mm-hmm.
The thing is, when things are calm, then the victim doesn't want to bring up anything.
Right.
They don't want to rock the boat. But that's the time that actually you can. There's the cycle of violence. There's an arc where there's a build-up period, and people usually, even with emotional abuse, sometimes it's just out of the blue, but sometimes there's a tension build-up and then a lashing out, and then maybe there's a period of remorse. So the time to set a boundary might be really early on, not when it's already, the person is already raging at you.
Right.
Then you can't have a conversation.
You're right.
Then you might just say, stop it. If you don't stop, I'm leaving.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't like it when you criticize me. Please stop. And think about it ahead of time. What consequences can you live with? I remember one time I was being abused in a car, verbally abused, and I just got out of the car, said, pull over, and got out of the car. That had a huge impact, because an abuser will believe what you do. Victims usually believe the words of the abuser, but an abuser will believe your actions. Actions speak louder than words.
Yeah.
So if you walk out of a room, you leave a restaurant, take your own car, things like that.
Wow.
You might want to take your own car to events if you think it's going to turn out ugly.
Exactly.
The person's going to be drinking or something like that.
Yeah, and you never know.
So another thing you can do is agree to part of it. Like, you didn't have dinner ready on time, and what kind of wife are you? You just said, yeah, I didn't have it ready on time. Do you still want to eat it? So you want to be educative in your approach. And I explain this in dealing with a narcissist and difficult people. So you want to, I can't go into we don't have time to go into it all, but you want to describe what happened and the behavior you want and how it's going to benefit the abuser if they change their behavior.
So give us an example. What would that sound like?
So when you put me down and belittle me like that, my loving feelings go away. And I just don't feel like having sex with you.
Mm-hmm.
But when you spend time with me and ask me about my day, I feel closer to you. And then I'm happy to, go to the ball game with you. Whatever, you have to think about what it is they want.
Right.
Whether they want you to entertain for them, have sex with them, or cook for, it's going to be different in every case.
Right.
So where's your leverage? And I have scripts, and I explain all of this in my book.
Yeah.
Dealing with a Narcissist.
That's fascinating, because you have to really think of these things in advance. You have to be prepared. You have to, think through some scenarios and really plan for standing up for yourself, for having healthy interactions and being calm,
right?
When things like this happen. So
yeah,
that's really good information. Well, Darlene, this has been fascinating. Any last words? And then also tell us where people can find more out about you.
Okay. First of all, my website is whatiscodependency.com, and there's links to talks in my YouTube channel, Facebook, audio recordings, tons of blogs. You can sign up for my monthly blog there, or my newsletter, and I mean my mailing list. And there's links to all my books there. And I guess, you know, it's our relationship with ourselves is a template for our relationship with others.
Mm.
So the more that we can love ourselves and build our own self-esteem and watch how we talk to ourselves, you know, when we stop blaming and shaming ourselves, we won't allow other people to do it.
Right.
So I guess that's my parting words.
I love it. I love it. Thank you so much for coming here and sharing your wisdom and giving us insight and giving us tools for our tool belt to help ourselves through or after these relationships. I really appreciate it, Darlene.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure, and I'm glad to share it with your audience. I hope it's helpful.